Okay, welcome everyone to the inaugural seminar of the new Marine Social Science Network Australia online seminar series. First of all, I just want to give a couple of ground rules, and I've posted these in the chat as well. The seminar is being recorded because we'll be posting these seminars onto the Mars Oxide YouTube channel. If you're not speaking, please can you turn off your video and mute yourself. Also, the seminar will be about 30 minutes. So please post any questions you have in the chat as we go along, but there'll also be time for discussion at the end, and any questions that are posted in the chat will be kept to the end of the seminar. So without further ado, I'd really like to introduce our very first speaker, Andrew Outhwaite. Andrew followed his passion for surfing into studying marine science and working in coastal conservation before further study in leadership and sustainability. He then co-founded a series of entrepreneurial ventures aligned with the vision of a sustainable society in areas such as homelessness, resilience of regional communities, and advocacy for startup companies. In the last 2 years, he has been called back to the oceans and his passion for science, and he has created the venture For Blue, which focuses on questions related to enriching humans, oceans, and ecosystems, and the demonstration of innovative solutions in practice. So I will pass over to you, Andrew.
Awesome, thank you very much for having me. And yeah, just really excited to be here, especially for the inaugural one. So hopefully sets a positive precedent for future seminars. And as per Karen's introduction, my background in academia is limited to an honours in geography after a bachelor in marine science, and then a master's in sustainability and leadership in Sweden. Actually, so I'll tell you a little bit about my background, so you've got some context for this research that I'm presenting. I'll run through the approach, methods, some of the results, and some of the frameworks that have come out of it, as per the description, to talk about action logics and what that may mean for things. So I'm very interested to hear and have discussions at the end about how you account for different ways that stakeholders involved in marine science make meaning, and also just about how what is the effect of doing research and other initiatives on measurable ocean health. So I'm going to switch over and share my presentation. So Karen, can you just confirm that the presentation is showing up as intended?
Yeah, we can see that fine. Thank you, Andrew.
Great. Okay. Okay. So yeah, the one presenting today is really phase 1 and phase 2 of For Blue research, and For Blue since earlier this year has also been formed as an organisation. This research was actually initiated a year and 21 days ago, and there's been some fantastic people that have contributed along the way to both the research, the photography in the report and research. People have been interviewed, stakeholders have participated in briefings, and also just acknowledging that this was done on in Walyalup, and acknowledging the Whadjuk people as the custodians of that land. Having said all that acknowledgement and gratitude to all the contributors, these views and what I'm sharing are definitely my own. So the intention really behind this work was an extension of some questions I've held for a long time around humans and our interaction with the environment and how that looks in coming decades and centuries, because it seems to be on a unsustainable trajectory at the moment where neither the species nor the planet may survive in a healthy relationship. So specifically, this For Blue research was to discern and describe opportunities for Western Australian institutions and innovations specifically to beneficially contribute to the health of the Indian Ocean and the dependent human populations. So this emerged out of a basic observation that Western Australia sits on the edge of the Indian Ocean, and with no significant nations sort of in the middle of that nation, we are as close to the centre of it as anyone else, and are recognised as a hub for marine science. And yet, despite there being papers and things written about strategies, there wasn't really a movement or a clear way in which we were going to contribute to the health of the Indian Ocean, or what our role and relationship was with those other nations. And it seemed like a domain where Western Australia could be good for the world in a way. So the commitment that I made to looking into this situation, this intersection of the sort of ecology of the ocean, Western Australia's economic activities, and the social ontologies, so what we take as existing, meaningful and valuable. So the commitment to this was, I basically said, well, I'll see what I can find out in 200 hours, and spent that time over 4 months and invested about $25,000 worth of time and money from one of my other businesses to just look into this space. So as well as wanting to answer the question, I was also wanting to get some practice in research, because I hadn't done formal research for a while, but also identify potentially some new ventures or companies that I may get involved in. I thought, well, while I'm looking into those questions, I may as well produce a report out of this research so that no one else has to do it. And also that allows me to test a bunch of other hypotheses. So the approach, sort of from very practical level, was to have a look at what was observed about social, economic and ecological systems, and then try and take a scientific approach to this sort of broader question of health. So the healthy interactions between economies, the humans, and the economic systems. And I want to reference one emergent field called apathology, which significantly influenced the framing of this research, which is a field concerned with identifying and enhancing the dynamics that enable the healthy development of systems. And a really powerful metaphor in the first published paper in that field was this metaphor of a continuum of development across two, I call, horizons of meaning. And they're complementary perspectives, as one on the prevention of disease and one on the generation of life. And so the orientation of this research was really to discern what are some opportunities and activities and framings of the human-oceans relationship that could be generative. There are a range of hypotheses, actually, at multiple levels. So I'll just go back to this slide. So one of the hypotheses was really about there being the potential for Western Australia to be good for the world and good for the ocean. Another level of hypotheses, and I've got I've got a bunch of them printed out here. Another level of the sort of hypotheses in this work was around how would people in those systems respond to the presentation of some of these opportunities and ideas? Because if this research or work was to have an effect, one of the first things to understand is to see what are the humans in the system intended that it would have an effect in. What are they receptive to? There's also another level of hypotheses from a business perspective about the return on investment. So what may come out of this 200 hours invested, and how may the market respond to it? And then there's also a number of hypotheses within the research related to dominant concepts or industries in this broad sort of ocean health space. So a scientific approach was taken to all those hypotheses. It's actually got a lot in common with methods from lean startup. So lean startup methodology is something very popular in entrepreneurial circles, which is illustrated on the top left here, with hypotheses, designing experiments, testing to generate insights for a commercial purpose, which is similar to but distinct from a scientific method, which is about, say, a question that hasn't been answered yet and seeking to make conclusions that advance a field or advance our knowledge. The approach taken to the research was broadly abductive, so a combination of inductive and inductive and deductive methods at different stages. And practically, when I'm talking about, the sorts of methods, so there's a literature review which ultimately 150 different sources were cited. And the approach to that literature review was a bit more, it wasn't so systemic or systematic, it was a bit more abductive. So having a look at what's relevant, significant and important. What are some dominant concepts and themes in the sort of domain, the scope of the Indian Ocean and the future health of it and the role that Western Australian industries and institutions could play. So it was dominant, what were recurrent themes and what were sort of things that were emerging, so new memes or ideas that were coming up. There were also, another part of the methods was interviews, so there were a set of 14 pre-prepared questions and semi-structured interviews that were looking at both specific projects that people were working on, but also their meaning making and ideas about answers to the research questions. So this resulted, that research then resulted in a publication, and the publication itself was actually another tool that was used to further test some of these hypotheses. So the publication, I'll just share a little bit about that. But just to say that the publication was actually used in a series of briefings, so 25 briefings have been done with academia, economic development professionals, representatives of foreign governments, to test what they discerned as being relevant, significant and important. So there's a theme here, which is not just what is important, being blind to my own preferences, values and meaning making, but what is important to the stakeholders that are actually having a significant impact on the system. So I'll talk you through briefly the resulting publication and then get on some more stuff about the frames that have been informing it and have emerged from it. So the publication actually identified 9 areas of opportunities for Western Australia, and that was actually quite deliberate. It was knowing how much people can handle. It had to be less than 10 concepts, and the publication had to be less than 30 pages because of that interest in people's receptivity to these context and content, and just knowing how much people can handle. So out of these 9 themes, I'll give you a couple of examples. So one of the propositions, which we use proposition to say this is a bit more like an invitation based on assumptions, to say, is there something there around Western Australia and our oceanic identity? And could we in the ocean benefit from deliberate curation of stronger oceanic cultural identification? And so this was actually one of the more popular propositions when presented to people. And as presented in the report, it has a series of observations at the top, the proposition and some explanation of that, inspiration of relevant examples of oceanic identity being developed through festivals or projects, and then sort of further research questions to investigate whether this is a viable proposition for Western Australian institutions and innovations to invest in that could benefit both the Western Australian economy and the health of the Indian Ocean and the wealth of neighbouring nations. In the report, it was also presented with references and a bibliography, and this structure was repeated 9 times. So when presenting to stakeholders, another one that was very popular was remote intelligence. So what I did in presenting to stakeholders was, in the briefings, was structure the presentations so that it was possible to test hypotheses I had about which which concepts and which frames and what they valued most out of what was discerned from the report. And oceanic identity, remote intelligence, capital growth, which is another proposition, and ecological stewardship emerged as the most popular from those 25 briefings. The remote intelligence one is, I think, was popular both because it's quite technical, it's a clear solution, it's something that leverages significantly off WA's specific industries and skills, and people can see how those industries and skills and technologies could be extended, say, beyond the oil and gas industry or beyond the limited application of them in marine science and into other things, including inspection, maintenance and repair, and doing things much broadly across the Indian Ocean and helping other nations do the same. So I'll just sort of wrap up with a few, getting into the meat of what the presentation and the invitation to this was about, which is to say that some of the hypotheses behind this were about, again, discerning what is of value and what is valued by the Western Australian stakeholders, and very conscious that once these concepts and ideas have been presented, first impressions are made, and that people will hear these concepts and the research results in the context of what's valuable and meaningful to them. I want to use the metaphor of a nautilus shell and introduce the idea that the way humans make meaning, as from children to adults and then through adulthood, can evolve and expand, that we can add greater capacity, as the quote on the prior page suggested, that the dimensions and shape of our minds can expand over the course of human life. There have been many researchers such as Lovinger, Piaget, Wilbur and others that have used research to create models of how human meaning making evolve. So this is one diagram that illustrates how human meaning making evolves from impulsive, a mindset that's sort of dominant and self-serving in what's called the opportunist in this model. The diplomat, who's motivated by fitting in, experts that are focused on problem solving, being skillful, efficient and excellent, and so on. So this model, this has been tested and validated with 10,000 respondents between 2002 and 2020, and is just one of these models of the evolution of human meaning making. Now, the way this relates back to this for blue research and the marine social science context is really a question about what is perceived as valuable by the humans, and can that be by us humans and humans in a particular social system? Because what is meaningful and discerned as valuable and the way people relate to it is almost like gravity. It will define what they perceive as being valuable and what they think should be done about that. And so in our work in marine conservation, marine science, how are we accounting for these discernibly different types of meaning making, and for the fact that they both evolve over time and that they interact? So much like different species of fish in the ocean or around a coral reef, there's different dimensions and types of meaning making that are discernible. It can also be a discussion about how they interact with each other. So that's a sort of very sort of abstract take on it, but you can imagine, like, what's the relationship between sharks, dolphins and turtles? And if we were to assign an animal metaphor for each of these sort of forms of human meaning making, you might get a sense that there's actually an ecology of meaning making about ocean health and opportunities. So one of the last propositions actually presented in the report was to say, how may we not only facilitate harmony amongst different ecological needs, economic activities, but also about our own meaning making of the value of the oceans, or what the oceans are to us. And is that something that Western Australian institutions could play a role in through conferences, through research, or otherwise? So that's briefly sort of a taste of some of the frames and overview of the research that was conducted through phase 1 and phase 2 of For Blue. And so some questions that I have sort of emerging out of this, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, are how do we account for different meaning making in our policy and in your research? Do you discern the significant differences between people that are, say, in the worlds of, or within the worlds of conservation, or within the worlds of marine science, or within marine industry? Can you see different complexities of and different scopes and dimensions of people's thinking, and how do you account for that in research? And also I'm interested to see, because what I've tried to do in this research, that this research itself had a hypothesis about what its benefit would be and what its specific contribution might be in the sort of Western Australian system of how we think about and relate to the ocean. So they're a bit meta questions, but they're almost about, what is the role of, say, marine social science or research like this in the ecosystem of all the science we're doing in answering these sorts of questions. And the last thing I'll just mention is that some understanding of how human meaning making has evolved over time as a culture, it just points to very profound implications for how we think about the oceans. Because we can look back through history and see different ways in which the oceans have been conceived, and know that that will evolve in the future, and that we are going to pay attention to different questions in the future than we had 50 years ago. And there isn't a static baseline of values or meaning making about the ocean. And so when we're thinking about caring for ocean health, which would take decades, centuries, for it to recover, or for us to get health, the ocean's health, say, back to where it was better than it was before, is that even an aspiration? And in making those sort of having those long-term intentions, how do we account for the evolution of our own thinking about that? So that's it. Yeah, looking forward to the questions and discussions. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was super, super interesting. And I'm definitely looking forward to chatting a bit more about some of the issues that you have brought up there, and some of the thoughts and questions that you've raised there as well. So I'd really like to throw it open to the floor, I guess. I'm hoping that our participants have loads of fabulous, interesting questions or comments to make. If you want to ask a question, please either throw it in the chat or please do just jump online and unmute yourself and ask a question. And perhaps to get us started, I'll throw one in there while everybody else is thinking about how to compose the questions that they have. One of the things I was wondering about, Andrew, was early on, I missed something that you said, and it was a type of ology. And I was wondering if you could talk us through that a little bit more, because it sounded super interesting.
Yeah, so it's apithology, so apithology. And yeah, it's a field concerned with identifying and enhancing the dynamics that enable the healthy development of emergent systems. So you may have picked up on that sort of that theme in what I was describing, is an interest and care for what are the dynamics both between elements of, but just general healthy dynamics in healthy systems, and what enables that health. And that's quite distinct from, say, an approach that may be focusing on preventing sickness. And so it is oriented towards generating health now and in the future. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. It's something that I would definitely be interested in reading a little bit more about, I think. So I'll definitely have a look up on that. Do we have any other questions from the floor? Please do jump in. I have a million questions. Well, here we go. We've got some questions from Marie. So Marie asks, on the basis of this, what do you think the top implications of your findings are for, firstly, human meaning making and how it might be changing under awareness of climate change? And then it looks like another question may be coming, but if you want to start off with that one.
Yeah, so I guess first of all, to say that I have findings, I would say they're very much propositions. So there hasn't been a lot of deduction and induction in sort of validating sort of particular hypotheses that have emerged from it, but there's certainly interesting questions. So I think I know that in the domain of climate change that many people who do research in the evolution of human development and meaning making have written extensive papers on this. And there's quite a body of literature, including from people in Australia. So the implications there are rather than say one dominant meaning making being the right one for how we may address climate change, there's an increased level of compassion and care that people may respond very differently and conceive of, so ontologically, what climate change is. And if we seek to, there are costs to pursuing a single framing of climate change in terms of you may create schisms between parts of society and different industries, and you may burn a lot of time and energy debating the meaning making and ideology, even though, say, practically you may agree on taking the same action, and yet our actions are driven by the meaning that we're making. So I guess I'm trying to say is that it's an appreciation of the actual complexity, and that we have tools and frameworks that can help navigate that complexity. And it's in a way not that complex. It's just saying, look, here's 10 different ways to make meaning. It's just 10 different objects. But it's a lot to get people's head around that other people could have a different meaning making and value set, and it's just as valid as their own. That's probably the big leap.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm loving the fact that Marie is sending through lots of questions. It's great. So a second question that Marie has asked there is, how do you draw links between the 9 priority areas or propositions that you've identified and human influence on the oceans?
Yeah, so and I can see that the rest of that question as well, as they all actually have implicit theories of change, and they were actually selected for that reason. So one of them is around adaptation, specialization. So can we become sort of expert and really good at using multiple disciplines to adapt to sea level change? You can see that's a profoundly different theory of how we relate to the ocean compared to forecasting the health of the ocean so that we can proactively collaborate across industries, sectors and nations in enabling its health. Like one's like, can we adapt to these changes that are being forced on us? Another one is, oh my goodness, we're in charge of the system, with others. We need to think about what's the future desired state and forecast how we're trending towards that. So yeah, very different theories of change. And as I said, the sort of phase 2 of conducting the briefings and testing different people's receptivity to those propositions was a way to see, okay, what is likely to be the most popular theory of change in Western Australia at this time. Not to say that's good or bad, it's just this is really popular. So if you wanted to focus on ocean health in Western Australia and you ignored the popular ones and went after one of the difficult ones, you might have a hard time. If you want to get traction, can you have the same ethos but frame it in a different theory of change to progress, what Western Australia or our institutions are really good at? And it just may not be harmonising governance. It really may be remote intelligence. But that's a unique contribution in the context of everything that needs to be done to conserve or to enable healthy oceans.
Absolutely, thank you. One of the things I was wondering about, and Marie's kind of mentioned this just at the end of her section as well, is around the growing edges of interdisciplinary research, and how I think particularly how interesting the whole concept of meaning making is in that, because I think a lot of the time, even within social science, we talk a lot about values without actually thinking about that process of meaning making that goes beyond, like, that happens underneath those values, if that makes sense. And I think that there's a really interesting question there in terms of when we're doing when we're doing interdisciplinary research, how do we deal with things like meaning making and incorporating that into that sort of research? And I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, because I think that's a really interesting question.
I think it is a very interesting question, and I don't think meaning making, as I presented it, is the only way to frame or organise values. Economies are very good at discerning what is valued between different industries and sectors. So there's a form of value that can be quantified in that way. I certainly think that I think, again, personal opinion, that the intersection of the ecology of human values and meaning making and the ecology of the oceans, like, it's really, that's where the action is where and how they intersect. Like, that people value cute mammals more than they do seagrass, or that the actual ecology of the ocean it's more significant about the acidity than the level of sea level rise, but the humans don't really care about acidity. So there's values on multiple levels, but I certainly think that the very first thing to do is for researchers to be conscious or be interested in what is the values frame that I'm bringing to this. What is the world likely to value out of the research I'm doing? As well as, yes, how do I consider different values and meaning making? If I'm doing research that involves people, either who may do something with the research or in terms of interviews. So yeah, I think there is a lot to be learned from other domains that can help with that. To help make marine social science more valuable, like, literally that self-reflective capacity, I think, could mean that it gets more traction.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Marie notes in the chat as well, it's a ongoing epistemological and methods-based question. And I think, yeah, it's a super interesting one to think about. We've also got a question from Matt as well, which I'm sure you can see in the chat, which is, should our governments be doing more collectively to support this sort of level of innovation rather than industry having to rely on startups and private capital?
I think should is a... I was sort of struck by the should. I'm like, yeah, of course they should. But I think I guess just to come back to sort of the frame of the research is should, if I say should, it's sort of coming from a place that I know best, or that this is what would be best, and who thinks that. And I think part of this research and this approach is trying to get things to land without having to make a big splash. So trying to bring new concepts and ideas into play, new frames, or get new industries growing in a way that is is supported by the existing values that they have, recognising that evolution takes time. So to go back to the Nautilus shells, if I think that government should be operating like with a much bigger scope and caring much more about the Indian Ocean, but they don't yet, the reality is they don't. But what do they care about, and what sorts of questions and propositions could sort of lead them in that direction? So I think there's just a look. I think it's in Western Australia's own interest, and I'm being very WA centric here because that was the scope of the research. Very, very much in both our interest and the interest of neighbouring nations and of the Indian Ocean for us to take a leadership role at this level, because no one else around the Indian Ocean rim has the resources, has the skills, has the capabilities, has the sort of coastline, has the diversity of ocean marine environments. And so, yeah, absolutely think so. And I think it is, the other angle on that is to say I've been pitching to the startup and private capital industry, trying to tell them what a big opportunity that this is. So that's the other flip perhaps on Matt's question. Sorry, long answer. But
no, that's great. And it is a great question. There's a question there around social good, I guess, and the role that government plays in delivering that social good, as well as the role that industry can play in that. And there's some really interesting questions for me there around, are we seeing a changing role around who provides social good, and that movement with the hollowing out of the state, movement to private corporations, you know, providing much more in that space. So I think there's a lot of really interesting questions in that space as well. Do we have any other questions? No other questions coming through at the moment. I mean, I've got a million questions for you, Andrew, to be honest, because I think everything you've presented is really interesting. You talked a little bit about how, and this might lead on from the last question, you talked about how you had presented this work to stakeholders, and it'd be really interesting to hear a little bit about some of the feedback that you had from, whether it was from government or whether it was from industry, some of the feedback that you had around those propositions.
Yeah, so I've got some of the sort of responses in front of me. So I'll give you a cross section of sort of the receptivity. It's worth noting that this evolved quite a lot as it went along, as we tested different hypotheses and that had implications for the plans for further research. So initially we were planning to launch the report publicly, but then we realised that would miss the opportunity to get detailed feedback from individual stakeholders. It would just be out there. And so we did this between September and December, a series of briefings sort of privately, so we could really discern what was going on for different stakeholders. So there were some organisations that operate internationally, and when presented with this research, they were almost like, yeah, so what? As in, yeah, we get all this, so what? And I'm like, oh, so the significance is that no one else gets it. And they're like, yeah, we know, it's so frustrating. And so in a way that was interesting, because they were like, okay, so what? Like, what do we do about this? Because we're already aware of the complexity of stuff, of complexity of the situation, all the options, and we're working at this harmonising governance level, like the real at the top end of it. But in a way, I don't think they sort of really got the truth of the validity of everyone else's theories of change and ways they were tackling the ocean environment. There was a number of private companies and industry groups that really just heard, they were really, really excited about one thing very much in particular. They were like, blue carbon. We see a big opportunity. And then they're like, okay, which one are we going to get after? Can we run a remote intelligence conference, etc. Just checking whether you're still there.
Yeah, sorry, we actually lost you just a little bit there, Andrew. If you could just give that response again regarding the interests of industry, that would be great.
Yeah, so some people in industry and some organisations really collapsed down and focused on one very, very specific opportunity. Because they're like, okay, this is all great, and we want to start a business that focuses on blue carbon. What can you tell us about that? So sort of really focused and collapsed it down to that, or what are the prospects for different types of aquaculture? And then there were other institutions that, like say in government or civil society, that said, look, this makes total sense, and we haven't thought about it this way before, but this helps us make sense of everything that we've been seeing happen between these different industries and sectors, that we now have this context of a broader blue economy that includes these different industries and sectors, Western Australia's position in it, and how the different sort of clusters of potential relate to each other. And so they got very excited, and some of those conversations have turned into quite practical collaborations in terms of events and innovation hubs and things like that, where they see that this paints a bigger picture of things that need to be connected that haven't been connected. So if I was to sort of look back very briefly to the sort of meaning making that was being made, most of the responses were really about getting things done, or responses from people that are relatively, say, expert focused on technical solutions and problem solving. And there were a couple that were more this sort of strategist level appreciation of the interaction of all these different industries and sectors and meaning making. The last one that was really interesting is the theme around oceanic identity, which got, when a couple of ministers, this was presented to the Chief Scientist and Minister for Fisheries, they really picked up on oceanic identity, recognising that, well, they were saying that Western Australia doesn't really have a coherent narrative around our identity and what it looks like in the future, and this oceanic identity could really be powerful. So they were very excited about that. More so than anyone else, I think it's because they're just tapped into how important it is, the sort of narrative that we have as a society.
That's great, thank you. That's actually, the oceanic identity one was one of the things that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting, and I was actually going to ask if there was some sort of WA specific Indian Ocean identity that, you know, that maybe wasn't blatantly clear to other people, or does that exist? It sounds like possibly not, but that there is actually opportunity there.
Yeah, I guess it's the sort of brute fact of how dependent we are on the oceans. Like for 20% of our protein, 20% of Perth's fresh water comes through desal. 50% of our oxygen. 95% of Western Australians live on the coast. And it's sort of seen as, there's a few industries, and we have a beach place that builds ships, and we have high value MSC certified fisheries, and we do lots of oil and gas, but most of our identity comes from sort of the outback or facing east or facing inland. And yet, day to day, people love the ocean. We are an island nation. Like 70% of our territory is underwater as a nation. It's just that sort of collection of brute facts that resonates with people individually, and they're like, yeah, we are ocean people. It's not like a new thing they aspire to. It's just sort of, we are. We already are. Now, what there isn't is that isn't reinforced or encouraged through, say, arts and cultural or social events. So it's very much in the domain of sport, recreation, and work. But we don't have stories and narratives and festivals and traditions and rituals, even though we have the oldest continuous culture on earth that has those stories that we haven't yet started to pick up on. There's been some really interesting marine social science work done in the Kimberley and in selected locations in Western Australia. But yeah, adopting it as the core of who we are, I think, is potentially very powerful. And it's something that someone probably needs to do a bit deliberately. But it's easy. So
yeah, that sounds like a great idea for a PhD project to me. But there you go.
Yeah. Well, look, I actually good. I'll pick up on it. So the sort of intent really behind this now is to say, who do we need to be as humans, but particularly around the Indian Ocean and Western Australians, who do we need to be such that we are enriched by the ocean and we enrich it, and it is enriching in perpetuity. And that does come down to, I think, identity and culture. And I think there's a rich resource of existing traditions and cultures, whether it's what fishermen do out at the Abrolhos Islands, or the types of ships we build down in Henderson, or the stories of traditional owners in the Kimberley, that we can draw on to deliberately create this culture of caring. If we wait and don't do it deliberately, I suspect that it'll be it's very hard to get in front of the unsustainable ways in which we are relating to our ocean. The signals from it not working are too slow. And so it is an interesting PhD, I think, to say, knowing all of this about meaning making, what might it mean to create the conditions to get in front of it such that it is actually mutually enriching? And I don't know what that looks like. I do not know the answer to what a culture of caring that has that benefit. I don't know what that looks like.
That's sort of research, perhaps.
Yeah, and it seems really important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Andrew. What I'm going to do, if you don't mind, is I'm going to close up this seminar for today. That's been thank you for a fabulous presentation and raising some really interesting points, and also thank you for answering all of those questions. There was some really interesting discussion points there, I think, as well. So I'm going to call this to a close today. But what I'll say is to everybody who is on this call at the moment, and to those who hopefully later will watch it on the MarSoxI YouTube channel, please contact Andrew if you are interested. We'll make sure we put his contact details alongside this video. And so that's pretty much it for today. Thank you so much for undertaking our inaugural seminar, Andrew.
Yeah, well, thank you for the MarSoxI network, and creating a platform for such interesting discussions that, very profoundly important.
Absolutely. Thank you.